Formula E could have looked very different if it had taken a different path when it very first started. Instead of being a one-make championship with everybody driving the same car, originally the idea was that lots of different car designs would have taken part in the opening season, and some of those design proposals were absolutely wild. This video takes a look at some of those designs. These are the lost cars of Formula E. Now I want to make it clear that I'm not going to be looking at some of the really wild, incredibly cool but not entirely serious proposals like these Mahindra Pininfarina concepts. While they look like a huge amount of fun, they weren't really serious design proposals for actual real race cars. They were just vague visions of the future. What I want to look at instead are the serious proposals, which were made between 2011 and 2013, and the first of these was a lot more than just a proposal. It was a fully running car built specifically for Formula E, but before Formula E was even called that. I am of course talking about the Formulec EF01. This car, which was in part developed by Brawn GP, essentially launched the Formula E Championship. If you want to know more about this car specifically, then we do have a video specifically for that, so go over and have a watch of that if you like. But what I want to talk about is how the Formulec ended up defining the regulations for what Formula E should have been, at least in the eyes of the FIA. Now the FIA had laid out some key objectives for Formula E and for any new cars competing in the championship. The cars would have to have roughly Formula 3 levels of performance, and they needed to be able to run at racing speeds for about 15 minutes. The minimum weight was set at 780 kilograms. At this point, no car swapping was discussed. The races were going to be much shorter than they eventually turned out to be. As I mentioned, it was not initially certain if the championship would have fully open regulations where multiple constructors could fight it out, or whether it would be a one-make series where every team has an identical chassis. However, there was a third possibility that a number of different chassis would be approved for teams to choose from, a situation not dissimilar to LMP2 when 4 chassis were approved for use by the ACO. For this video, I'm going to concentrate on the cars which would have competed against the Formulec had the series chosen to be fully open or have that limited number of approved chassis. Notably, Alejandro Agag said around this time he didn't want Formula E to be just a clone of Formula 1. He wanted it to look different, more futuristic, and he also didn't want it to be dominated by aerodynamicists. He wanted it to be all about the electric powertrains. So it's no surprise then that the first design proposal that Formula E received was really quite a wild one. The Fondtech E-11. This was a car masterminded by respected F1 engineer and aerodynamicist Jean-Claude Migeot and the project lead Luc Gasparini. Just how unconventional the design was really became obvious when you look at the car from the side. The driver basically sat very high on the car, on top of the battery pack. This was essentially a double-decker chassis, with the lower chassis housing the twin motors, the battery pack, and carrying all of the suspension loads. The upper chassis would essentially only house the driver. I think this design gives the car a rather top-heavy look, and just take a look at that steering column arrangement. The design team behind the car, though, felt that this arrangement was the safest solution, much safer than a conventional car design. This was because the driver chassis would be entirely separate to the main chassis, meaning that in theory at least, if there was an accident, there would be no chance of fluid leaks from the battery cells into the driver's compartment. The car itself would be four-wheel drive with motors mounted on both axles. Pushrod suspension featured all round. It all just looks a bit out of scale though, doesn't it, because of the height of the car. In terms of the aerodynamics, a very low drag concept was used, and it underwent significant CFD testing using Fondtech's in-house capabilities. Note the slight upsweep towards the rear of the side pod. It's not really a ground effect car, but it's oddly similar to the March 712 from the 1970s, where Peter Wright was just beginning to explore the ground effect concept. I wonder if that's what Fondtech were trying to achieve with this side pod design. Another area of drag reduction are the pods ahead of the front and rear wheels. These are actually very similar to some of the 2012 IndyCar concepts, which had been revealed about a year before this car was. However, it is important to point out that the Fondtech team do state that their their design was already well advanced in 2009 before those IndyCar concepts had been seen. This shot of the monocoque suggests that it would have been moulded together as one structure, with the two compartments, upper and lower, sitting bonded together. Note the bracing element behind the rear bulkhead as well, to give the chassis a bit more strength due to that incredible height from that double-decker layout. With the chassis and all of the bodywork removed, it's clear to see how the driver is sat on top of a load of batteries. Downforce generation on the car came from a small diffuser on the centerline of the car, along with a single element rear wing and a single element front wing with two small upper flaps. Fondtech claimed to have run the car at 60% scale in their own wind tunnel, and I vaguely recall seeing some photos of that model in the tunnel, but I can't find them at all, so maybe I'm just dreaming about that. And yes, I do dream about wind tunnel models. Fondtech claimed that the first chassis was already under construction and the powertrain had been bench tested, and it was expected to make its first test runs on track in early 2012, but it never did. Next up is something of a curious one, Bluebird. The Bluebird name is famous in terms of land and water speed record breaking, firstly with Malcolm Campbell and then with his son Donald, who was later killed during a water speed record attempt on Coniston Water. Campbell Sr.'s grandson Don Wales was behind this Formula E project. Wales had already broken the UK land speed record for electric vehicles in 1997, and he raised it further in 2000, and in 2011 he tried and failed to raise it even further. With a prominent team name and an active electric motorsport project, Bluebird seemed like a really good fit for Formula E, and Wales attempted to enter the series. The first Bluebird Formula E concept was revealed in London in 2012, curiously painted black, which is odd for a team that's always painted their cars blue, but, you know, whatever. This was clearly nothing more than a mock-up though, and it showed a clear direction of design. Notably, it was a closed cockpit car, something that was not only seen as safer, but also significantly reduced aerodynamic drag. This first concept was called the Bluebird GTL. Mechanical details were not really available at the time, and the team claimed that the body was just being used for wind tunnel testing at that point, and it didn't exactly grab the headlines. Some more sketches later emerged, claimed to be from Bluebird, but I'm not certain how official or serious these sketches actually were. By 2014, it was clear that Formula E and Alejandro Agag in particular wanted to have a one-make championship, with every single team using identical Dallara-built Spark Renault 01E cars. However, the FIA had not yet given its blessing to this approach, and there were rumours that it would insist on Formula E being a multi-chassis championship. Indeed, it was claimed that the Bluebird project was encouraged to continue working on its own car design. A new Bluebird Formula E design concept had been created by that point, and at first glance it does look a bit like a Dallara Spark or Generation 1 Formula E car, as it seems we must call them these days. Look closer though and you'll start to notice a few significant differences. Starting at the nose, which is lower and narrower than the Spark design, it also picks up on the front wing with a single pylon. Actually, this reminds me quite a lot of the Dome S103 Le Mans car with its nose and front impact structure shape, but these two cars are absolutely not related. The front wheel bodywork is more angular and features an extended footplate compared to the Spark design. A small bargeboard sits ahead of the leading edge of the side pod, which itself features an additional aerodynamic element. At the rear, the design is very different, with the bodywork sweeping in very tightly, exposing the pushrod rear suspension and leaving the rear wheels housed in external pods. Note the shape of the rear wing and the small protrusions at the base of the end plate. I think this image at first glance represents a serious proposal, but when you look a little bit longer, you start to notice some issues. The rear of the car in particular looks very cramped in terms of accommodating and cooling a large battery pack and electric motors. The feathered base of the rear wing end plates are very similar to what was common in F1 around that time, but it seems unlikely that a Formula E car would need to have that level of aerodynamic advancement. With this in mind, looking at the design overall, I do wonder if this was much more of the idea of the sort of thing that Bluebird would like to build if they were actually allowed into the championship, rather than a serious design study. According to the team at the time, Bluebird was in discussion with at least two teams about running its car in the opening season of Formula E, if it was allowed to get an entry. Bluebird had also been working quite quietly on a battery hot swapping system, where the car could pit mid-race and the spent battery pack could be replaced with a fully charged one in around 15 seconds. This would have allowed for much longer races and no no mid-race car swaps. Notably, the second Bluebird concept is an open cockpit design, but closed cockpits were very much of interest to a number of teams. Drayson Racing had beaten Bluebird and another competitor to the UK electric land speed record. Paul Drayson, officially titled Baron Drayson, was a former British government minister and biotech entrepreneur. He also raced his own Aston Martin GT car and later a Lola prototype at Le Mans. That Lola was later converted into his electric record-breaking car. It was not the first time that Lola had contemplated a design for a Formula E-like championship. Some years earlier, it was working on a similar concept in partnership with Zytec called the Zero Championship. Motorsport magazine has a really good article about it online, so I've posted a link to it in the description. As this project predated Formula E, it shouldn't be confused with the later Drayson Lola car concept, which still remains unseen to this day, but Lola did have a design for a Formula E car on the drawing board. That partnership between Drayson and Lola was initially expected to continue, and in January 2012 it was announced that Lola was actually developing that Formula E chassis and designs were progressing well. But just a few months later, Lola went into administration and was later bankrupt. In the meantime, former Brabham, Sauber and Arrows F1 designer Sergio Rinland had designed a concept for Drayson's Formula E entry, and that's what you're seeing here. The mechanical layout was not disclosed at the time, but the closed wheels could have caused some brake cooling issues, at least if conventional brakes were used. That concept was later recycled by Rinland into the Dunlop branded future race car concept, and that revealed a few more details about the concept overall. The car could have been built somewhat lighter than a conventional electric racing car because it would have had smaller batteries and it would have used induction charging pads located around the racetrack to charge on the move, much quicker than having to swap and change cars or even stop and change batteries. This also meant that the car didn't have to carry such a large battery pack. It would almost be like a real-world Scalextric sort of thing, if you like, though the pads wouldn't have been all the way around the track, just in certain locations. Curiously, Rinland proposed not to use any conventional brakes, at least at the front of the car, and rely purely on the energy recovery capability of the electric in-wheel motors to decelerate the car. The car featured 4 in-wheel motors and torque vectoring to improve cornering. Active aerodynamics also played a role too. This was not a mere concept sketch, though. Rinland had fully designed the concept in quite a lot of detail. Drayson Racing did actually get a Formula E entry, and they would have had to have used a Spark Dallara because by that point it was a one-make championship. Before the season had even got going though, Trilly GP had taken over that entry. Lola, on the other hand, did eventually make it to Formula E, although they too had to use a Spark Dallara. Bit of a shame for a famous car manufacturer to use another car manufacturer's chassis, but that's part of their partnership with Yamaha as the company starts to rebuild itself. The next chassis builder, well, complete car supplier actually, I want to talk about is Toyota. Toyota wanted in at the very beginning of Formula E via its TMG Motorsport consultancy in Germany, now known as Toyota Gazoo Racing Europe. Toyota had quit F1, leaving a vast and cutting-edge motorsport R&D facility. So some of the staff still working there turned their attention to a Formula E design, and Pascal Vasselon, who was the Formula 1 team technical director, was believed to have been leading a small team designing a Formula E chassis, and another team was working on the powertrain. TMG didn't really feel it needed to demonstrate its ability to build a chassis though. After all, it had just quit Formula 1 and it had done the World Rally Championship and the Le Mans 24 Hours out of that facility, so it literally had everything it needed. What it did need to do though was demonstrate its ability to build an electric competition car, something it had never done before. So it did just that and took an old Radical chassis, fitted it with an EV powertrain and took it to the Nürburgring to break some records, which it did. Ultimately, the spectacle of the Spark Dallara fighting it out with the Lola-Drayson and the all-wheel drive double-decker Fondtech and maybe even a Toyota never happened. Formula E was a spec series and remains so to this day. I can't help but feel that the series would hold a lot more interest for fans and perhaps even manufacturers if it was allowed to have different chassis and different power units from the word go. Oh, I should have said right at the top that I'm also going to take a look at least one of the widely forgotten proposals for the Season 5 Formula E revamp in the follow-up video to this one. So if you've enjoyed this electrifying trip into the archives, well, there's a lot more to come. But for now, please hit like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon somewhere in the pit lane.